Hey everyone, I'm a student intern at Triangle Arts, and I will be in conversation with our resident artist, Rebecca Levitan, today. Rebecca, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. So I'll start off the conversation. How do you think about subject matter in your work?
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I'm just going to share my screen really quickly so that we can sort of see my work alongside talking. So I'm a painter, and I primarily make representational, say, narrative paintings, right? So you see objects that are recognizable in the work. And because of that, I think, and also it's just sort of a very common question, right? Like the first question you get at a cocktail party, tell somebody you're an artist, okay, what's your work about? And I've been thinking a lot about that word, about. What does it mean for something to be about something else? Um, and in one way, my paintings are about very concrete things, right? They might come out of things I've noticed in the world, things I'm thinking about, things I'm reading about. Let's see, just to sort of give an example of a sort of, oh, this painting, for example. I had a day job on the Upper East Side, and so I was walking around the Upper East Side a lot during the day, and I noticed that all the dogs on the Upper East Side are blonde, and we're wearing these sweaters, and so I thought that was just sort of a funny thing, and so that might be a piece that sort of comes in and then eventually becomes a painting. So in some ways, my work is about all these concrete things, but then in another sense, you hear someone describe your painting that way and you're like, wait, my painting's not about that at all. My painting's about so much more. And hopefully I feel like if my paintings are successful, or really if any work of art is successful, right, it becomes about something bigger. It becomes about something that's sort of indefinable, right? And if I could tell you, well, my painting is about how, it's a problem that all the dogs on the Upper East Side are blonde, right? If I could just explain that all to you, then like, why would I be making a painting? Hopefully I'm making a painting because I'm trying to sort of convey something that's beyond words, or else, I'd be a writer, or I'd be a public speaker. And so I think it's this tricky thing that like the paintings are both about these very concrete things and also, are about so much more and are expressed through the language of painting. So they become about the act of painting itself. And another thing I've been thinking about, just sort of in terms of the subject matter, one thing I think is really interesting about painting, almost kind of the way we think about singer-songwriters or rappers, right? We kind of expect when a singer-songwriter is like is singing a song in first person that it's about their life, right? And that's sort of like an assumption, right? And then you talk to a lot of singers and they're like, no, that's a fiction. That's maybe based on my persona, or maybe it's a totally different character that I invented. Like, but we see the face singing it and we think like, that's you. And I think we often have the same relationship to painting, where we assume that like, whatever the painting is like your soul bared onto the canvas. And I'm kind of interested in like why we think that, because for me, a lot of the most interesting things in the world are most interesting stories to tell are not stories about me. Like, I'm not the world's most interesting subject. Um, but I am interested in making paintings that maybe feel like they're personal, or feel like they're coming from a first person perspective, right? There's like, my hand is very visible in a lot of the paintings. They feel very personal and hopefully very felt in the way that I'm painting them, but they're not necessarily about exactly my experience. Of course, at the same time, right, like you can't help but look back at the work that you've made and think like, oh, all of me has like somehow made it into this painting, but it's not necessarily like the starting place for what I'm thinking about. Um, yeah, so I think it's an interesting conversation, especially around representational painting, because I think sometimes we're too quick to sort of like reduce sort of the subject matter concerns of a painting. I see this a lot, actually. It's funny. I see this a lot on Instagram, where people will you know, you'll have a conversation with someone, they'll say, oh, I couldn't possibly tell you what my paintings are about. Like, it's very complex. And then they'll post something on Instagram and it'll be like, hashtag flowers, hashtag like summer art, hashtags like, oh, so you are able to, you know, you are suddenly able to reduce this very complex thing into this series of hashtags, which I actually think is kind of like a, often detrimental to those paintings.
And so, one of the early points that you made was, from what I'm getting at, is you want your paintings to have this sort of like, it is personal in a way, but you want it to have like an open interpretation, it seems.
Yeah, and hopefully not in like the most obnoxious way, which is like, oh, I'm just going to throw some things out there and like hope that you come up with a better, a smarter thing to think about it than I have. But I think good work sort of starts to, you know, starts almost like, you know, like the proverbial like, you know, like it starts to gather, it starts to gather meanings, and like those meanings start to layer upon themselves and sort of start to maybe speak to a larger story of like what it means to be human and what it, you know, like larger themes. And so I hope that people like, you know, have an emotional experience with a painting. It makes them think about maybe something in their own life or something they've experienced. And so I'm open, you know, I think all those readings are valid, but I'm not necessarily like, but I hope that doesn't sort of like absolve me of responsibility to actually like think through the subjects that I'm interested in and become the paintings, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. It reminds me of like Lovecraftian style almost, where a lot of it is like just your imagination of the story that you can make in your mind.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's probably true of like, or at least for me, of like all the art that I appreciate. In some senses, you know exactly what it's saying, but in another sense, it's open enough, and it connects enough to like your humanity that you're sort of able to have your own personal experience with it.
Yeah.